Hello and welcome to another episode of Warm Blanket, the podcast where we embark on a journey to see what makes us feel good about Star Trek, where is our love comes from, and what it means for us. In short, what is our warm blanket? My name is Gary, I'm your host, and I'm very fortunate to welcome here for the very first time Steve Fatheree from the TexTrek podcast. I hope I pronounced your name right. Um,
Yes, you got it right.
Thank you. So he and his co-host Dave started their journey together in one memorable day when Star Trek celebrated its 50th anniversary, and their mission ever since has been steady: to talk, share about the values of the show, and essentially about their love towards the show. And I'm very fortunate that he is in here with me today. And please give everyone a warm welcome to Fatheree. So Fatheree, how are you today?
I am great. We're currently under this lockdown situation with the pandemic going on, but I'm making the best of it.
So that means so much Star Trek.
Yeah, there's plenty of Star Trek to keep me occupied. So if I can't go outdoors, it's not that big of a deal. I have over 700 episodes of Star Trek to watch.
So if you could choose a destination from Star Trek, where would you like to go right now?
Like, actually go to the location in the show,
Oh no,
or
like in a Star Trek universe, if you would have to choose one place to go in lockdown, like where would you spend your lockdown?
oh,
Rise up,
uh,
that Bajor.
those are probably all really good choices, and like you would think like the holodeck would be ideal because then you could just go anywhere. But if I had to pick, it would be Deep Space Nine, just because I love that space station and I love that show, and I would like to be quarantined at Quark's bar, and I could still use the Hollow Suites there, so it's kind of a win-win. And I get to hang out with Morn, and Julian and Miles would come throw darts with me, so it'd be fun.
That's awesome. So talking about Star Trek, how did you get into the show? How did you? When was the first time when you started watching the show? Who was the biggest influence in your life to getting into the show?
Well, it took me a little while to get into it, actually. Like, when I was really young, I was born in '86, and I remember being only like 2 or 3 and being into Star Wars, watching that show or those movies on VHS and really liking that. And I knew of Star Trek, like the Next Generation was around, and I knew there was, oh yeah, that guy with the ears is Spock, and then there's a guy with a visor on his eyes who looks kind of cool. That's Geordi. And I didn't really get super into it until around 1994 when the movie Star Trek Generations came out. And when a new movie comes out, there's a lot of promotional material. They're
Yeah.
showing the trailers and TV spots, and there's posters. When you go see other movies, you'll see a poster for it. So it was all of that stuff made me really curious, and that's when I kind of started watching all of the TOS crew movies. The place where I used to rent movies from, they didn't have the motion picture, so I didn't see it till later. But I started with the Wrath of Khan, and then watched The Search for Spock, and I was like, these two are awesome. I have to see what happens next. So I went through Star Trek 4, 5, 6. On TV, Deep Space Nine was on. I could still kind of find reruns of the original series or Next Generation, and then shortly after that, Voyager started. So I kind of got into all 4 of those shows at the same time. I bought the Star Trek Encyclopedia that Michael and Denise Okuda did back in the '90s. That the episodes that I hadn't watched, I could read about them in there. So I kind of learned a lot of the events of the shows, and just the basic stories and all the different characters and stuff from reading that encyclopedia. And eventually over time I was able to track down all of the shows on first on VHS, and then later when they did the DVD release, I bought all those box sets. But yeah, so it was like the mid '90s was kind of like when I went full on hardcore fan, and ever since then it's just been my most favorite thing. I'm a big fan of like Marvel and DC comics and Doctor Who and it's a bunch of other stuff, but Star Trek has always been number one.
Which is awesome. I mean, just hearing you and just kind of reminds me as well that I I myself loved different shows before Star Trek, but Star Trek was always like in the background, like something that I always wanted to look into it, and I never had a chance, or they never had in air, but always in the newspaper, but always in the, so late, then it passed way past over my bedtime, and I remember watching like Sequest and occasional Star Wars, but I wasn't really, the fun of Star Wars, and not till this day. But that's another story for another day. But yeah, this is awesome. So ever since you became a Star Trek fan, how did it affect your life?
That's an interesting question because I don't know if I love Star Trek because I like the like that version of the future where humans have kind of progressed to this very equality driven post capitalism society, or I kind of like the naval flavor, how they're all kind of like sailors on ships, exploring like in the old
Mm,
days. All I like the sci-fi concepts like weird temporal anomalies and stuff like that. And I don't know if I love Star Trek because I like all that stuff, or if me watching Star Trek as a kid is the reason why I like all that stuff now.
mhm.
You get what I'm saying? Like, so Star Trek might be the reason why I'm interested in all of that stuff has that frequently shows up in Star Trek. So I
Mhm.
think it might have like a pretty big impact. I think like it's informed a lot of my um, political views, or like my morality has probably been more shaped by Star Trek than anything else.
Wow, that's awesome. When so I would love to know when someone from the very far just shouted Star Trek without any context. What is the first thing that comes to your mind?
uh, yeah, I've heard you ask this question to your previous guest that you've had on here, and I always thought, like, that's interesting. What do I think? But I think what comes to mind is just kind of a hodgepodge of like all the different shows. Like, when they do like you probably notice this type of stuff a lot because you work in like graphics and stuff. But when they do like those posters that have like
Hmm.
Kirk and Picard and Janeway and Cisco and Michael Burnham, like everyone,
Hmm.
they have like characters of all the different shows.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I see when I picture Star Trek. It's like the Enterprise and another Enterprise and the Defiant. It's kind of like all of it. It's just kind of like this huge variety of like different shows and different characters.
Hmm. So there's no like one thing that like, because I know for me, if let's say someone says Star Wars, I either think about Darth Vader or one of the droids. But it's cool because with Star Trek myself, I don't think about like one specific thing. Like, a lot of people would think about the Enterprise, or Kirk or Spock. Usually I got the inspiration with a lot of people like, oh yeah, Dr. Spock. I was like, that's not the same. But yeah, it is interesting to I think it's a good thing. So you kind of see the whole franchise, not just one thing, which is a beautiful thing. Not that it's anything wrong with seeing just the Enterprise or Picard or whatever, Cisco. So in going into your text track a little bit.
Mhm.
I'm curious how the idea formed and what made you start your podcast.
Sure. Well, that was back in 2016, and we were approaching the 50th anniversary of Star Trek, and I thought that was pretty exciting. Like, I remember being a kid in 1996 when it was the 30th anniversary, and thinking like, oh, it's good. Someday it'll be the 50th. That'll probably be like a huge deal, and it wasn't as big of a deal as I thought it would be. But uh, at the time, I was also listening to a bunch of podcasts. I was watching a lot of YouTube. I had a job where I could kind of like do that at work, and other things that I was a fan of, like Star Wars or Game of Thrones specifically. I remember I was also kind of getting into Game of Thrones at the time and reading those books and watching that show. And there were all these people on YouTube who talked about, like the lore and the history there, or like followed the production of the show. and there were all these podcasters that were focused on Game of Thrones, and I kind of felt bad because I was like, Star Trek should have this too. And I think it's partly because like there hasn't been a lot of Star Trek content lately, but I was telling myself like I need to find more Star Trek content on the internet. And I ultimately like didn't think there was a lot. It just took me a while to find some of the stuff, but a couple of YouTube channels. Trek Yards was around back then, and I was also I discovered the Trek FM podcast network. Um, but I eventually decided, like, you know what, I could do this myself. So I asked around some of my friends. I don't have like a huge following of friends that are big Trekkies, but my friend Dave, he works at the comic book store I shop at, and he said that he would sign up to serve on the Starship Texas. That was actually his idea to call it TexTrek because we were talking about like, well, what are we gonna call it? We're just gonna talk about like Star Trek kind of in general, and talk about like these new shows that they're making. And he was like, why don't we just call it TexTrek since we're in Texas? And that'll get people to be like, oh, I wonder what like these redneck cowboys down in Texas are doing, talking about Star Trek. I was like, okay, I guess. And so that's what we ran with. And I couldn't make up my mind if I wanted to do something on YouTube or something podcast based. So I decided like we needed like a long form format. So we started recording audio only podcast, but doing it on video so we could put that on YouTube also. And that's what we've been doing. And it's been a lot of fun.
You still do kind of a variety. I mean, I realized your latest episode reviews and season reviews for Picard, for instance, speaking of which, they weren't just only you talking like a live video recording. It was more like talking and plus pictures overview. So it was more like an audio format, right?
Yeah. We experimented with some different stuff, especially lately that we can't all like come sit in a living room together and record because we're all social distancing. So we started experimenting with like some live streams and stuff. And I always tried to like take images and overlay them in our videos just to give it some visual flavor and make it not as boring, just like watching two people sitting in a living room. Or sometimes we're on a green screen. Sometimes we're on the bridge of our ship, the Starship Texas.
Yeah, I did see something really cool. Your intro is really funny and ingenious in many ways. I mean, the fight scenes and the mirror version.
Oh yeah,
The private.
yeah. We fight the mirror Fatheree and the mirror Dave.
But that's awesome. And I also noticed that you pilgrimaged to Iowa in Captain Kirk's birthplace.
Yeah.
How was that like?
That's an interesting story. Okay, everyone listening to this has to promise not to tell anyone. Or
Okay,
not
so
to...
that two people who are gonna listen to this probably at this moment.
This is what happened with that. Is I started doing TexTrek in September of 2016, and the job I was working at laid me off in December of that year, and I didn't get another job until April of 2017. And part of the reason why I took the job is because the company is based in Iowa. As we all know, the home of Captain James Tiberius Kirk, right?
Former boy.
I always wanted to go to Riverside, Iowa, and see the actual future birthplace of Captain Kirk. This little town that they kind of declared themselves, this is where Kirk is going to be born. So I always thought it'd be cool to visit that. And this job it was an insurance company, and they had like 3 different openings, and I applied for all 3 of them just because at the time I was on unemployment benefits, and you have to be looking for jobs, applying for jobs to continue to receive those payments. So I applied for all these jobs, and they called me and they interviewed me, and they're like, okay, we're gonna interview for like these 3 different jobs. And they kind of offered me all three of them, and they said, "Which one do you want?" And one of them was called Ops. I mean, like it's insurance, so it's kind of like underwriting insurance, super boring stuff. I was like,
Mhm.
Ops. Well, that's what Data's job was on the Enterprise. So I was like, I guess I'll take that one. And then they flew me out to Iowa for 2 weeks
Wow.
for like training.
Hmm.
And so while I was there, I drove to Riverside, Iowa, and got to see they have a little. It's really small, but they have this cute little Captain Kirk Star Trek museum, and then they have the monument where they say this is the official spot where he's going to be born. They actually, it's kind of funny. They have a bar there. I can't remember the name of the bar, but they used to have like the sign under the pool table, and it said, "This is the future place where Captain Kirk will be conceived."
That's funny.
Yeah,
So they
they moved
kind
the
of build up
sign.
the whole hype in the
Yeah,
city just to draw in more people, I guess.
yeah, they do have like a big festival there every summer. There, I think they call it Trek Fest. And that wasn't
Wow.
going on when I was there, so
Hmm.
it's just me walking around with my camera recording stuff, looking like a weirdo. But they're probably used to Trekkies, showing up and doing that. So
That's awesome.
you do that type of stuff too, though. Like I know you went to Vasquez Rocks, and you've been to Ticonderoga, right?
Yes. Well, in Ticonderoga, I was in with a very good friend, Sean, Trek on the Tube, who probably
Hmm.
you met. Um,
Yeah, I know that
so
guy. He's kind of a
yeah.
jerk. No, I'm just
No,
kidding.
not
I'm just
that's
kidding. I
Bob.
love you, Sean.
That's
I love
Bob.
you.
If Sean, if you're listening to this, that's Bob. We all know that
Oh
that's
yeah,
Bob.
yeah. Bob is the jerk.
No, so yeah, I had the fortune to meet him in person, and we had a wonderful time going down to Ticonderoga or Traconderoga, as a lot of people refer to it these days. And meeting James Cabley was absolutely fantastic. And yeah, when I did the road trip the following year, 2018, with another good friend of mine who does Stargate stuff on YouTube, the Stargate guy. For anyone, if you want to look up for Stargate and stuff. So we went through quite a few things, and Vasquez Rock was fantastic, and the Japanese garden in Ben Nice was fantastic too, for the Starfleet headquarters slash academy. So yeah, but a few things, but these things are always amazing to go to, just to because you've seen it on screen. It's like meeting someone, which I'm pretty sure you had a
Mhm.
fair share of experience meeting people from all different Star Trek shows.
Yeah, yeah. I like to do conventions when I can and like see the actors. I don't spend a ton of money on autographs anymore because if I'm at a con, like, I mean, it's cool to get an autograph from Brent Spiner or Denise Crosby or Kate Mulgrew or somebody. But instead of like spending hours waiting in line, I'd rather kind of like talk to other fans and do stuff like that. But yeah, I love like seeing the actors. I love like going like their Q&A panels and get to like ask them questions. And I did Star Trek Las Vegas for the first time last year, and that was a ton of fun. And I did the Star Trek cruise a couple years ago,
Oh yeah, I
uh,
remember.
and that was the best vacation I think I've ever been on. But yeah, me and my girlfriend, like, we like to travel, so we try to save up all year for a big vacation every year, and she's been nice enough to let me do a Star Trek vacation twice. So
Cherish her so much.
yeah.
No, that's awesome. So is it any different than a convention? I mean, obviously in a cruise ship you're like because I only just seen the pictures from online, and of course people talking about like, oh, how much fun we have in the cruise. Uh, Never had a chance to do that. Maybe in the far future. But is it more informal than a traditional convention, or can you like approach people still, or they are still like confined in their quarters?
So when I went, there were certain actors were definitely hiding more than others, but I mean, some of them were very social and very friendly, and would talk to fans and stuff. And I heard on this last cruise that they just did this year, there was even more of that. Like my good friend Thad, who's on the Delta Flyer Star Trek Voyager podcast.
Hmm.
He was actually taking pictures on the beach somewhere at one of their destinations that they went to, and Nana visitors, Major Kira herself,
Hmm.
just photo bombed him on the beach. He's trying to take a selfie, and she just like shows up next to him and gets in the picture. So that stuff like that is really cool, I think. Um, I also like I rode on an elevator with LeVar Burton when I went, and so they are kind of like just walking around the ship, right next to you. Um, but there are definitely like some of the actors they you didn't see them around as much. So I was kind of thinking like you're probably just like hiding from all of us in your cabin or something. But for the most part, they also did like events, like they had every night some different performance where a lot of these actors would um, like John Billings or no, not John Billingsley, Ethan Phillips, who played Neelix on Voyager. He did stand-up comedy one night, which was kind of funny. And they had like the Star Trek Rat Pack, where like
Oh yeah, they are
a lot of them do
fantastic.
like the Sinatra stuff. Yeah, so that was fun to see. So stuff like that. The cruise is definitely fun. I had never gone on a cruise before, so that was just kind of like a new experience. But that was my favorite of any Star Trek trip I've been on.
And what was your? Is there any favorite encounters with any Star Trek actors, people?
We one of the destinations that it went to the year I was on it is it went to Mexico, where they have those Inca temple
Hmm.
ruins, and they took us on like a tour of that. And I was there with Armin Shimmerman,
Oh,
Denise Crosby, and Michael Dorn.
wow.
And I got pictures with all three of them, like standing on like these ancient Inca pyramids. So that was a lot of fun.
That must have been one hell of an experience. Like just being there with all these people, like semi casually.
Yeah, it was weird, but I loved it, and we want to do that again. So hopefully next year we might be going. If it doesn't, I know it might get canceled or something because of this virus, but
Mm.
we'll hope for the best and see what happens.
No, absolutely. So we talked about your podcast, and at the beginning when you said when you started out, you had certain things to talk about, but of course pretty much a little bit later when you started, Discovery popped up, and then that started the conversation for all of things. So how do you find like the the course of your evolution in terms of TexTrek changed from the very beginning then up till now that that we have lots of current Star Trek to talk about?
Oh yeah, it was interesting because starting off, we knew that this new show was coming out, so we were going to follow the development of that. But we also wanted to talk about past Star Trek, and our mission statement used to be, the home of Star Trek fandom from deep in the heart of Texas, where we talk all about Star Trek, old and new. And lately, I've had to change that to now it's the home of Star Trek fandom from deep in the heart of Texas, where we talk all about Star Trek all the time. Because we're almost always talking about new Star Trek, and we never have time to talk about the old Star Trek anymore. Because with these two shows that are out and more shows on the way, but I do want to try to like circle back and revisit some of the older shows because I love those so much. But we started off with following the development of Discovery, and then branched off to Picard, and then kind of in our downtime we would talk about uh, different episodes that might be relevant. For example, like we covered all the first episodes of every show before Discovery premiered, so that we could kind of compare that to the other first episodes. We talked about after Discovery season one. We talked about all the Mirror Universe episodes from Enterprise, original series, and DS9. We covered all of that. And that's when we met the Mirror Universe, Dave and Fatheree. Those guys are a couple of jerks. They can give Bob a run for his money. But with going into Picard, we talked about All Good Things and the ending of Next Generation. We covered all of the Star Trek movies, all of them, all 13. So where we're at now is we're going to be so busy talking about Lower Decks and Discovery and Picard and what else is coming out? Oh, the new the Nickelodeon
Oh yeah,
Star Trek that they're
Star
gonna
Trek that we
make, and
still don't know anything about.
hopefully this Pike show that I'm dying to get. Like I need this Pike on the Enterprise show so bad. Uh, so hopefully that'll be something we're talking about. We did I think a year ago, it might have been longer. We covered the entire first season of DS9 in one podcast because that is my favorite Star Trek show, and that's actually one that Dave hasn't watched much of. So
Really?
he was watching like this first season, most of it for the first time, and we've wanted to kind of do that with season two and other seasons, and so I think we might do that. As we'll be talking about all of the old Star Trek shows, but we're kind of going to do them like a season at a time, and also talk about like the new shows that are coming out.
Hmm. That must have been a really interesting experience for him to watch, and then to witness someone to watch it for the first time.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun because a lot of those episodes. It's kind of like around season three was when I was really like watching every episode of Deep Space Nine. I never missed an episode. But and we were only talking about the first season, but even that, like I had seen all those episodes so many times, and they're so ingrained in me. And then seeing him, watch them now for the first time, and kind of see like the stuff that he noticed that never really occurred to me, and just like hearing his opinion, how when Deep Space Nine first came out back in the '90s, he wasn't real keen on it, and all these years later, he's kind of turned around that opinion and he's really enjoying it now. So just hearing how his opinion changed over the years was really fun.
Hmm, that's awesome. So we touched on quite a lot of things in terms of what do you like and actors interaction and just in general about Star Trek. And as you probably know because you listened to the previous episodes, and as I mentioned, Warm Blanket is basically the my interpretation of Star Trek that makes me feel comfortable, and then that's something um, that I'm passionate about, in a sense. And a lot of things I did mention in my pilot episode that what is my warm blanket when I think about Star Trek. I really would like to see and ask you, what is your warm blanket when it comes to Star Trek?
Well, I keep gushing on DS9, so that one is obviously. I mean, that's my favorite. That when I watch like the opening credit sequence or the opening titles of Deep Space Nine, when that camera like pans over and then like you finally see the station.
Mm.
Whenever I see that, I feel like I'm going back home,
Mm-hmm.
and it brings back all like these memories, like watching that show every week as a kid, and uh, I feel like the biggest bond with those characters, but also the original series is probably well, definitely my second favorite Star Trek show, and I feel like I'm kind of unique in that because most people under 40 don't seem to love the original series as much as like the older fans.
Mm-hmm.
But like no, like I love TOS. For me, like that's where it's at with just building the foundation for Star Trek. And if I couldn't have Deep Space Nine as my warm blanket, I would want the original series as my warm blanket. I love the how iconic Kirk and Spock and McCoy feel in that show. I love like the kind of that old school '60s sci-fi vibe that is so unique that none of the other Star Trek shows can capture. And yes, yeah, like the special effects are cheesy and it is like very melodramatic. But I love that. I love like the big crazy music and the like the close-ups on Kirk's face with like the weird mood lighting and
Zulu
like
makeup.
yeah, like all of that stuff. I don't know. I really connected with that one as a kid. I think I was fortunate in that like I started watching a lot of TOS pretty early on, right off the bat, and so it allowed me to connect to it more than a lot of people that are kind of my age. I think.
Mhm. Is there any like comfort food episodes that you often revisit, especially in these days? But
Um,
aside from these days.
I'm such a completionist that I'm kind of like always rewatching Star Trek. So like right now I'm in Deep Space Nine season 2 and about to start well I actually cheated and I like already started Voyager a little bit. But I just kind of am always just like going through the shows, and when I get to the end, I go back to the original series and just every now and then I might go a month without watching an episode, but then like I'll throw on a couple and or put them on in the background while I'm working on something else. But I'm just always rewatching Star Trek because even the episodes I don't like, I like to kind of study them and be like, that's really interesting because this is the first time we see that character do this, or that line of dialogue explains something in this episode, and I just am always combing through the entire franchise, or at
Mhm.
least like the episodes. I'm not as big on I don't read a lot of the novels like I used to, or some of the other stuff. But as far as like the shows and movies go, like I'm always just cycling through there.
Mhm. And it's interesting, as you said, that sometimes you rewatch an episode that you didn't think like highly enough at the beginning. Like I certainly have one or few episodes as well that um, Voyager comes to mind because I revisited a few episodes just randomly from like the earlier seasons, and there was one episode when Neelix dies
Hmm.
and gets coming back because of the nanoprobes and stuff. Actually, that was a later season, but anyhow. um, so he comes back and he was dealing with all this situation, and I remember liking the episode, but I loved it when I watched it now after like all these years, and like oh my days, like that's such a beautiful episode and there's such much meaning, and this is not how I remembered. So like kind of seeing different aspects of the episode is beautiful to witness with any of them, like getting back to it.
Neelix. A lot of people don't like Neelix. I've heard people call him the Jar Jar Binks of Star Trek, and I hate that because I
Uh,
like the character. I know like he can get on people's nerves. He's a little too goofy sometimes. But when the show tried to do really serious stuff with the silly character, that was actually like some of the best Star Trek Voyager moments. Like in the first season, they had a really good episode with Neelix. Jet Trell, I think is the name
oh
of it,
yeah,
where
yeah.
where you see that doctor from what was the race, the Hakonians or something like that, where they basically like nuked his home, and where he kind of had to have like this conversation with this guy who genocided his people. And that episode is so good, and it's when they take like the silly guy Neelix and do these very serious things with him. Or the episode you mentioned where he has his crisis of faith. Uh, that stuff was really good. And
Mhm.
if you're just dismissing this character as just kind of like the goofball comic relief, you're missing out on some stories that are so truly Star Trek.
Yeah, exactly. Because sometimes the moments that it's someone think about like greatest moment of Star Trek, best of both worlds, or I don't know, First Contact, or City of the Edge of Forever, which beautiful things, and but these little pieces makes Star Trek what Star Trek is, right?
Right? Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being the show. It was an absolutely delight to have you on. I really enjoyed talking to you and getting your thoughts and finding out what's your warm blanket when it comes to Star Trek. Um, Thank you very much for listeners as well who listen to me and to listen to this podcast episode. You can find where we can find you aside from YouTube and Twitter.
Well, I have a website, www.tex-trek.com, so you can keep up with us there. But yeah, also like the best place to follow me would be on Twitter at TXTrek, or our Facebook page, facebook.com/text-trek.
Good, cool, that's awesome. Well, everyone, listeners who please connect with Fatheree and the TexTrek team. They are fantastic, and give them some love, subscribe and follow. And until next time, live long and prosper.
Bye.